Welcome to Foolproof Theology. It's great to be with you here today. My name is Chase Davis, and I'm your host. Here on Foolproof Theology, one of the main reasons I started this podcast was to talk to Christians who are in the academic world, who are solid convictionally, seeing the world in a similar way to me, but people who I want to learn from. And so today on the show, I am delighted to have Professor Dr. David Rainbow. He's down at University of Houston. He's a professor of Russian history today. So we're going to talk about some Russian history. This is a topic I've been curious about with everything going on in Ukraine. I always think I like to come at things from a historical perspective, understand worldviews and narratives that are shaping cultures. So excited to have David on the show today. Thank you so much for joining me today, David.
Thanks for the invitation.
So I wanted to hear, you're at the University of Houston, the Cougars. They had Kevin Sumlin as their coach, and that went well for them. And then he came over to A&M and did okay for us for a little while. But how long have you been down there at the University of Houston?
Since the fall of 2015, I moved here from the East Coast.
Okay. And so tell me about your background kind of as a Christian. Did you grow up in the church? What was that like?
Yes, I did. My dad was a pastor for most of his career and a Christian school teacher. He went to seminary at Westminster in Philadelphia and was a Reformed and then eventually a Reformed Baptist pastor for many years. And so my mom's a Christian, and so they raised me in the church. I went to Christian school for part of my schooling, K through 12 schooling, and I think really became a believer and started understanding my faith in a deeper way my senior year in high school. I ended up graduating. I went to a few different undergraduate universities, but I ended up graduating from a Christian university in Fresno Pacific University, and have been going to church ever since I was a kid, my whole life. As I got married right after college to a woman named Brady, who was also at Fresno Pacific, and we moved to North Dakota for a couple of years. I worked on a cattle ranch for 2 years, and the real reason for moving out there was to be a part of this little Reformed Baptist church that my family had connections to, and so we spent a couple of years out there, and went to churches in New Jersey when we moved out east that were Reformed Baptist and Presbyterian churches. As I kind of got into my academic career, I never stopped going to church. I never stopped believing, but I would say as some dissonance between my faith and my career emerged, and over a long period of time, my solution, looking back, I didn't think of it this way at the time, but my solution to that, looking back, was to get drawn into what we all now can affectionately call the sort of winsome approach to faith, where I saw myself as being able to thread the needle between kind of orthodox Christian belief and living and working and existing in a very non-Christian environment. And so I went to some churches that I think nurtured that idea, which I think was mistaken. Looking back, after reading Aaron Renn's article about the three worlds, it just all clicked. And it all made so much sense. So what I would say now is, I was living in the neutral world. And so I had this kind of conceit that I can do what I want, and I can be the exception to the rule. I can live in a kind of hostile environment and I won't be affected by it. But as the world went from neutral to negative, I started to feel that dissonance in a different way. And so started looking at my faith more seriously, I think, than I had for a long time. It had been kind of on ice, I would say, where I kept going to church. I was bringing my kids to church, but I was keeping my faith safe and at a distance so that I could survive where I was. So, that started changing probably in 2017, 18. It exactly maps on with Ren's schema, where, I started realizing a lot of the hypocrisy and a lot of the just mealy mouthed kind of wanting to have it both ways. And then when, 2019, the church that I was going to, which was very much a winsome church, started having racial reconciliation conferences and that sort of thing. I started, coming from the world where I had been studying. One of my advisors in graduate school was like a, dyed in the wool Marcuse Marxist, and so I'd been reading this stuff for a long time, and I always thought it was really interesting and exotic because it was so far fetched. And
Right.
then I started seeing this, like a lot of people, started seeing it coming into realms where I didn't expect it to come into, and started speaking up and asking my pastors, like, what are you talking? Do you know what you're talking about when you say things like, intersectionality, and when you throw yourself on the funeral pyre of, white racism and stuff in sermons? Like, do you understand where that's coming from? And just started having conversations, and they were very receptive initially, and would go out to coffee and have these long conversations about, the kind of intellectual history of all of this stuff. And then George Floyd happened, and my I guess kind of critique or calling them to give an account of how this matched up with our mission as a church was no longer welcome. And there was a long 6-month process of very long and somewhat tortured conversations, and then we left when it became clear that they weren't interested really in what we were interested in. So that was kind of the process back to realizing that this compromised approach of being all things to all people kind of thing is not really what I wanted to do, how I wanted to live. It's certainly not how I'm raising my kids, and so it's just the dissonance started to emerge.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think one thing I would be curious to know more about is in the academic world, you're pursuing these degrees. Fascinating story, by the way, going from a cattle ranch to the academy. Gives you kind of some broader perspective than a lot of people in the academy who just, that's been their career their whole life. But with your kind of relationships and the stuff you're learning in the academy, how did it play out, would you say, pre 2017 18, and how has it played out post 2017 18? Has much changed in terms of your friendships, your colleagues, how you teach? What differences would you identify there?
The real change, like if I went to 2013, which is the year that I finished my doctoral program, to 2019, that's the period that in my career I really noticed the change. I mean, when I was in graduate school at a very liberal private university in New York City, and there were Marxists all over the place, and in my classes, and it was great fun. It was to be honest, it's like everybody needs to have a conversation with a Marxist once in a while. That was sort of my approach. I study Russia, I study the Soviet Union. It kept things honest, is how I would
Yeah.
have described it, and how I think it actually was. These were robust conversations and debates about ideas um, that were important, if not, even if they're not persuasive, they're weighty, they're significant historically. There's a reason why, there are over 1 billion Marxists in the world still today. It's a compelling set of ideas. Its promises are attractive, all of that stuff that we all know by now. So it seemed very open to me. It seemed like the good old days. I have a lot of nostalgia for a decade ago in the academy, where you could have conversations where you disagreed. There weren't topics. I would say there's always been conformism in, not always, but in the last probably 50 or 60 years, there's been a lot of conformism in the academy. And we've known this for a long time. It's tended leftward since the 1970s, and that's been a steady leftward movement. There are political science departments at almost all of our best universities in the country that are 98% Democrat. So it's very homogenous, but that's not what it is like now. It's not, the issue now is not homogeneity. The issue now is censorship and kind of systemic gaslighting and just an unwillingness to call a spade or to dissent, or so it's just all of the cravenness that we see all over society, like reporters standing up and saying patent lies in front of burning buildings and things like that. All that kind of stuff is new. So the radicalism of people's ideas in the academy is not new, but the inability or the high cost of questioning the orthodoxies, that's what I would say is new. As far as teaching, I would say early on, so this kind of is the inverse of what I was just describing, where things have gotten more and more hostile. I think I was much less concerned with saying what I thought early on. I mean, I was playing the game. This is part of the problem, is that the academy breeds conformism, and I was a good little soldier. I had my convictions, and I always made fun of the jargony kind of, silliness that academics like to play. I've always been a bit of a, I think, contrarian in some regards, partly because of my background and partly because I just, I like ranchers more than academics in a lot of cases. So I never had a problem being a little bit of an outsider, but I didn't make waves. I didn't mess with things. And as things have gone more and more insane, it's been just easier and easier somehow to not care what people think, because I just I don't respect those dishonest positions at all, and so it just doesn't matter to me anymore what they think.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's an interesting place to be in, because you want to, hear different arguments. You want to be a reasonable person and give an answer for your faith and for what you believe. And yet when you see the lunacy of a lot of ideas, you kind of throw up your arms and go, look, this person can't be reasoned with. And, I'm not going to win them over by adopting a certain tone or by, having like 10 meetings with them. It's kind of just like, what are you going to do? And so it does provide someone with a lot more personal kind of like freedom in Christ to just be like, this is what I believe, this is who I am. And what's funny is you're actually embodying the very virtues they claim to embody. The kind of like willingness to dialogue, the willingness to talk about that. With your academic interest, you got into Russian history, studied at a university in New York. So what led you to Russian history? Was that something that's part of your family? Was that just something that was curious to you? What sparked your interest in that?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's not a family thing. Rainbow is a lot of things, but it's not Slavic. So I don't have any Russian or Eastern European heritage. So my first year out of high school, I was sure I wanted to be a sailor. And so I went to the California Maritime Academy and studied engineering and worked on a ship for a year and a half and loved it. It was great fun, an 18-year-old's dream. Sailed around the Pacific Rim and saw a lot of places. And that was kind of the impulse, was like, I like doing stuff with my hands, but I also wanted to see the world. And it was great. It was fun. But, somehow in my, 18-year-old mind, which was not all that lucid at all times, I managed to realize that being a sailor was not going to be satisfying for very long
Sure.
as a way of learning about the world, because it's like 2 days in Fiji and 4 days in Australia and a day and a half in Japan and a day and a half in Australia or in Alaska. And so it was great adventure, but it left me wanting more. And so that was one of the reasons I kind of changed my plan, and I dropped out actually and went and worked on a farm until I and resolved to wait until I knew what I wanted to learn, to go back to college. And eventually when I went back to college, I liked history the best. But the first thing I did when I got into a 4-year school as a history major was go into the study abroad office and ask them where I could go. And they had, this was in 99. I guess it would be, no, in 2000. And so they still had like 3-ring binders of pamphlets, from different places. And they're like, you could go to Milan, and they were like flipping through it. And I was either like, I've been there, or no, that seems too, I don't know, that's too typical. It was that sort of thing. And then they had this wacky little, mimeographed like half sheet of paper from Nizhny Novgorod, Russia, which is this provincial city. It's like the Russian Detroit. And and I as soon as she turned to the page and was like, we could send you to, provincial Russia, I was like, that sounds terrifying. Yes, that's where I want to go. And so it started just as a like just a whim and an adventure. And so I flew to Moscow in January of 2001 and spent the semester there, and just really got hooked, because lo and behold, a lot of the things that I was interested in about history, about political philosophy and political experiments, and as well as just trying to figure out this place that I hadn't been taught about in school, because it was mostly after the end of the Cold War. Russia just dropped off the map for most of our consciousness in education. I realized Russia was a place where I could explore some of these questions about history that I had. So I wanted to understand the Russian Revolution. That's how I got started in studying Russia. So then when I went back to graduate school, as I said, after college, I went and worked in North Dakota for 2 years. And by the second year, I found myself like binge listening to CD lectures. So it's like I had a CD player. And so I would have like the CD player, and I'd be plowing a field or fertilizing or whatever, or feeding the cows or cutting ice for them in the winter to water them. And I'd be like holding my CD player level, because it was a crappy one, so it skipped and stuff. And I'd like binge through these history lectures. And so it kind of dawned on me that I should maybe go back to school. So I went back to school.
That's awesome. What a fun journey. That's amazing, man. Yeah, it's one thing that's really surprised me in the last few years, but over the last 10 is like, dude, the commies were like some murderous people in just world history. And yet how often in our education system do we hear about that or not hear about it? It's a very odd omission in a lot of American education, when you would think it would be a more prominent thing. So all of a sudden, here we are, 2023, recording this, and in the last couple of years, I mean, we saw a Russian incursion into Crimea, but I think that was pre-2016, and then we have a war in Ukraine going on, and all of a sudden we see millions and millions of dollars being sent to Ukraine. It feels like, World War III could happen anytime. My sons have asked me about that. Kids at school are saying World War III, and I'm like, I don't know. I don't know what's going on. I just know it seems 2020, at least if you're someone who thinks like me, things seem very suspicious, and you're trying to discern things. So I thought, man, Russian history, and one of the things I'm curious about is the history of ideas and how cultures are shaped by those ideas, those narratives. Like in America, we've got, American exceptionalism. We've got Manifest Destiny with the westward expansion. What in the Russian mindset would kind of like shape and help us understand Russia and their kind of desire to get to Kiev and all this kind of stuff? What's going on there in the background that maybe a lot of Americans aren't seeing?
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, that's a good question. Even in the comparison with American ideas and the ideas that help us make sense of our past, and that are, in some cases part mythology, part reality, but that are really compelling and motivate our behavior. Because Russia, of course, like every country has those sorts of ideas, but unlike a lot of other countries, its ideas, I think, are particularly resonant for Americans. So, for instance, Russia has a kind of manifest destiny that historically is almost a parallel of American manifest destiny. So, throughout the 19th century, Russia was marching to the east. They had already, I mean, the borders of the Russian Empire were already on the Pacific by the 17th century, but it was working very hard to develop and settle its eastern frontier, just like we were working to settle our western frontier. It was building a railroad from sea to sea. From sea to sea, I suppose, if you
Sure.
take
Yeah.
enough connections, just like we were. They were a couple of decades behind when it came to that, and they saw themselves very much as a kind of civilizing force across Eurasia, just like, you know, European Americans saw themselves as a civilizing force across the United States. So there are these uncanny parallels, which, like, all the way back and at the beginning of the 19th century, really, people saw those parallels. So Alexis de Tocqueville, in his book about American democracy, one of the keenest observers of American society and American political thought, he has this famous passage about how in the 1830s, about how America and Russia are these two great countries that are going to dictate the future of humanity, and they're developing in parallel. And even though, autocracy and republicanism don't seem to have a lot in common, there are all these uncanny similarities, which I think partly explains why we've long had this frenemy kind of relationship with Russia. We're obsessed with
Yeah.
them, they're obsessed with us, in a way that Americans are not obsessed with Belgium or something like that. So they have a manifest destiny. They were trying to civilize. That's actually what I write about, is this kind of Siberian frontier of the Russian Empire. They
Hmm.
also, that can be deceiving, though. I mean, some of that is sort of superficial similarities. So, and here it gets to another one of the big narratives that drives Russian history. So, if America was moving to the West because we were trying to expand and, grab more resources and civilize the country and things like that, Russia in many ways was always expanding because it was afraid of its neighbors, which is kind of the opposite of what motivated a lot of American expansionist thinking. So Russia has this deep seated anxiety about its borderlands, and that's a consequence of being located in Eurasia, where for thousands of years many of the dominant powers have been nomadic. So they move large distances, they can strike very quickly, and they can do a lot of devastation without any kind of warning. And the Mongolian Empire, I mean, Genghis Khan invaded Eurasia and in the 13th century, and the Mongols ruled Russia for 300 years. So that's like a deep imprint on the Russian political psyche. And then, you know, in the 17th century, the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, a great power at the time, invaded Moscow, occupied the Kremlin, took the throne, threw out the Russians, and were going to rule Russia, incorporated into Poland. Now that didn't last. But then a couple hundred years later, Napoleon marched on Moscow and invaded Moscow and burned most of it to the ground, and threatened to erase Russia from the map. And then 150 years later, Hitler did it. So there, from Russians today looking back, this impulse of expansionism this is not an American kind of triumphalist expansionism like we often assume. It's actually coming in many ways from the opposite impulse, a fear of open borders. They don't have any natural barriers. There aren't mountain ranges in Eurasia. I mean, besides the Himalayas, but that's out of Russia's orbit. But it's steppe, and it's unbroken forest that runs from the Baltic Sea all the way to 100 miles from Japan. It's the largest forest that's in the world. So they've just have this deep-seated mentality. Some of that is fiction. It's not the case that every epoch in Russian history that they're on the precipice of getting invaded, but it's happened enough times that it helps to explain that mentality of we need to expand. So that's absolutely affecting the Ukrainian question from the Russian perspective. The NATO question, I mean, by now I think everybody's kind of realized that has something to do with this. I mean, in my opinion, the NATO expansion question over the last 30 years is the proximate cause of this war. That is why the war started. Russia would not have invaded Ukraine were it not for this, in my opinion, reckless and foolish, kind of grandstanding and saber rattling on the part of mostly the United States with respect to this, it's the right of sovereign nations to join. As late as this was January 22, so a month before the invasion, the full-scale invasion, Antony Blinken came out of a meeting with Putin, still repeating the same line that we've been repeating for 35 years, which is like, I don't see what the big deal is. NATO is a defensive treaty organization, as if it's not a threat to a country to have NATO missiles. It's just the level of delusion is really amazing. But Russia fundamentally operates its foreign policy according to this idea of spheres of influence. It needs buffer states to prevent it from going on the attack. And it's drawing on this 1,000-year-old, phobia of getting invaded from the outside, which, as I said, is not grounded in pure mythology. Whereas the United States and NATO and, the rest of the world that is arrayed against Russia is operating according to this Wilsonian idea of sovereign states get to do whatever they want. There's you don't get to tell them what to do, which of course is disingenuous on our part because we don't behave as if that's true.
Right.
And it's also just it's idealistic to the point of recklessness, because if Russia had missiles in Mexico, we would be playing the sphere of influence game. No doubt. Everybody knows that.
Yeah, that makes sense. One, you mentioned the Russian Revolution, and I hesitate to bring it up because we could talk for hours. It's a fascinating, especially because what I saw in 2020 in the last few years is kind of a revolutionary talk. But this stuff has been going on for a while, but especially in the last few years, it feels like, I've described it as a revolution. I've heard it written about as a cold civil war in our country. And so that's always piqued my interest to go, what happened in Russia, in the 1910s, to where all of a sudden you've got this Marxist revolution going on. So I was wondering if you could kind of boil down some of the players in there. I think there was a regime, and then there was a Marxist overthrow. What was going on in there? How should we conceive of like who the players are during that time in Russian history?
Mm-hmm. So 1917, which is when the revolutions happened, consisted basically of two. Well, not basically. It consisted of two revolutions. One in February of that year, which overthrew the autocracy. So Tsar Nicholas II, the last Romanov Tsar, was arrested on a train, forced to abdicate the throne. He tried to abdicate to his brother. He wasn't actually, this was not the Bolshevik overthrow of monarchy. He tried to abdicate to his brother because he was getting thrown out, which would have maintained the autocracy. And his brother kind of looked at that invitation and said, thanks, no thanks. And so the Romanov dynasty ended kind of anticlimactically that way. So at that point, there were two powers in the country that took charge. One was what came to be called the provisional government, and that was a more or less kind of liberal, left-leaning liberal kind of. There were a bunch of moderate socialists involved in that government, and they were trying to build a constitution. So they were calling for a constituent assembly. They wanted to make Russia a constitutional state. But at the same time, the Soviets, which in Russia, Soviet just means council. These were workers and soldiers' councils. So the Petrograd Soviet, which was the main Soviet in the country, which was made up, this is where like a lot of the radical left-wing socialists were involved. They also claimed power. They claimed to be speaking on behalf of people. And so there was this dual power that existed from February, and it was very unstable. Remember, World War I is still raging. Russia is still a combatant in the war. It's not doing well. And I mean, it was terrible. There was a really bad winter right before that. So there was famine, there were crops failing. It was a very, very bad situation. And by the end of the year, Vladimir Lenin wasn't even in the country when that happened. He was in exile. So he quickly came back to Russia, so in April of 1917, and immediately began calling for a complete overthrow of the regime and an institution of a Marxist state. And it took him a few months to get enough support, even from his closest allies. I mean, like Stalin and Bukharin and his other kind of right-hand men were telling him until the very end, like, no, we can't do this. This is too crazy. But Lenin pushed it through, and in October, they arrested the officials from the provisional government, and from that point on, were in control, and immediately began building secret police force and seized control of the military, and they were very strategic. So that's 1917. It's that was a contingent set of circumstances that it's hard to imagine with historical precedents and stuff. It's hard to imagine specific things happening the way that they happened in the past. That almost never happens because history is too complicated. There are too many variables, all of that. What I see as more relevant to kind of our situation is if you look at a longer time period, a longer span, and you look at what were the patterns and processes for decades before that helped to explain why by the middle of 1918, so a few months after this Bolshevik coup, it was really a coup in October 1917, by several months after that, you had literally millions of people who were willing to go out and kill and die in the name of this project. That's staggering and shocking. There were not that many Bolsheviks in the country. There were not that many Marxists in the country. And that, to me, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is the history of radicalism in Russia for the 60 or 70 years preceding. So, there were socialists writing in the Russian Empire, and there were nihilists writing in the 1860s and calling for the destruction and dismantling of, systemic this and systemic that. And then they got frustrated because it didn't work. That's not a popular idea, it turns out, to call for the destruction of everything that exists. And so they turned very explicitly to terrorism, to kind of one-off, these were not highly organized initially. They were not highly organized terrorist attacks, but they would start, killing this official or that official, or attempting an assassination of that official. I mean, they killed the Tsar. There were multiple assassination attempts on Alexander II, who was the Tsar from the 1850s until 1881, when they finally successfully blew him up in his cart. But to me, that like slow kind of process of acclimatizing yourself to this steady drone and drip of people justifying political violence as a means, not just as like lashing out or rage. I mean, murderers do that all the time. People get beat up on the street all the time. That's not that significant uh, when it comes to politics. But what is significant is people who are acting violently with the express purpose of transforming the system, of either desensitizing people to get used to it, or to gaslighting people into justifying it. I mean, we saw this like in spades over the last several years, or in getting people to just tune it out, which like the Covenant School shooting would be a case of that, right? Where that just cut too close to the bone, because we still don't know really what was going on with that. That's
Right.
that's kind of insane. And so that was happening in Russia from the 1860s until 1905, 1904, 1905, when because of, again, it's very, like, there are a lot of factors. They go to war against Japan. Japan attacks them, and so the Russo-Japanese War is going on, as well as this increasing unrest socially, and now that they're in an era of actual revolution. I mean, there were, in 1905, the autocracy almost got taken down. There were barricades on the street. The Tsar sent artillery into the heart of Moscow and shelled the crud out of the revolutionaries. It was a major revolution. And when that broke out, you had in place the terror as a mechanism for social transformation. Stalin said in 1917, so this is after decades, they had been reared on radical terrorism. He said in 1917, after they took over, he said, terror is the most efficient way to create a new society. So that to me is, I'm not saying that we're on the precipice of 1917, but to my mind, we're like in 1880, 1890, where we cheer on terrorists. We cheer
Right.
on violent political activism, as if anything has ever, anything good has ever come from that kind of ad hoc vigilantism.
Yeah, and I think that's also like it's a good warning for people even on who are not leftist, but people on the right, maybe more libertarian minded people. There's a famous story in Colorado of the Killdozer. Have you heard of the Killdozer before?
No.
It was up in Granby, Colorado, and this guy, basically there was either an easement on his property or the government wouldn't let him expand his muffler shop. And so he got fed up with the town, he got fed up with the government, and he was a welder, so he made a bulldozer into a tank, essentially, fortified it, welded it, and drove over buildings in the town. I mean, famous kind of, and it's kind of a libertarian meme at this point, like the
Okay.
Killdozer. And so it's even something you have to be careful of on any political persuasion you have when you believe that violence is the only answer or the most efficient means. And that's why I really want to listen to people who are actively trying to prevent civil war in our country, because I think a lot of people still live naively. They live naively. They live asleep as if that's not possible. That could never happen here. And it's like, well, it's already happened once. And so we shouldn't think too highly of ourselves. But I think it's really important as Christians that we actively show and help people perceive of better ways to go about, encouraging society to live in more moral ways, pursuing the good and the true and the beautiful without resorting to violence. Because like you said, it could take decades, but it could happen here too. So I think that's a really good insight into the kind of the conditions that led to 1918 in Russia. Would Russia itself consider itself at any point in its history like a self-consciously Christian people? I know they have a history of the Eastern Orthodox, Russian Orthodox Church in there. Would they consider themselves a Christian nation?
Let me take that in two parts. So Christian, yes, absolutely. I mean, this, another one of, you were asking about the narratives that drive Russian thinking and behavior today. And I mentioned a couple of them. Another one of them is that Russia is not only a Christian country, but is the Christian country. And this, so in 988, the Prince of Kiev, Vladimir, was baptized, and this is the heyday of the Byzantine Empire. So Ukraine is not that far from Constantinople, just across the Black Sea, and so Vladimir pretty wisely realized that it was going to be advantageous for him, this kind of relatively backwater podunk like Slavic princeling, to cozy up to the Byzantines and share their religion, et cetera, et cetera. So he forcibly baptized all of his people. So he was baptized, by the way, the story goes, he was baptized while he was in Crimea, in the waters of the Black Sea, which has been one of dozens and dozens and dozens of justifications that Putin has given for why Crimea has always been Russian and is Russian and all this stuff. So it's like this very holy site. So ever since then, the Eastern Slavs, or what came to be called Russians, eventually were Christians officially. All the princes were Christians. They saw themselves and strived very hard for several centuries after that to become a European player, so via Byzantium. In the 15th century, so this is like the decade that Gutenberg is pressing things with his wine press, Constantinople falls to the Turks, and the Byzantine emperors fled to Italy. Like they abscond, they took off. They abandoned Constantinople, and Constantinople becomes this really important Muslim country ever after. At that point, Russia started to see itself as the savior of all Christendom. Rome was a mess because, shortly after that, you've got the Protestant Reformation, which from the outside just looked like madness and chaos. And from the inside, it probably looked like madness and chaos to a lot of people too. And, it brought Europe to its knees for a century of warfare and conflict. So obviously Rome is falling apart. Constantinople just got taken over by the Muslims, and so Moscow now is the center of Eastern Orthodox patriarchy. And at that point in the 15th century, Russian czars started referring to Moscow as the Third Rome. And one of the lines from one of them was, the first Rome is I forget how they characterize that. The first Rome is falling apart. The second Rome is no more. The third, Moscow is the third Rome, and there won't be a fourth. So this is a deep kind of deeply embedded in Russian thinking, is how important Christianity is to it. I mean, there are a lot of different ways you could think about it, but right around this time as well, around the time that this third Rome idea came about, they started, the word for peasant in Russia is krestyanin, and the word for Christian is kristyanin. And it was right around this time that peasants, this was 85% of the population in Russia, started to be called essentially Christians. So they're synonymous. So Russian peasants and Christians are nearly synonymous. There's one letter different. So it's deeply, deeply embedded in their thinking. And obviously the Soviet Union was a bit of an aberration, where the Soviet Union was an anti-religious, persecuted Christians and every other religion. So that stands out as an anomaly. But what's happening today now, so the way that Russians make sense of this is that it seems bizarre in some ways from the outside, but the vast majority of Russian Orthodox Christians today, maybe not the vast majority, but a significant majority of Russian Orthodox Christians today, make sense of, are very pro-Soviet. They're very nostalgic for the Soviet period, and they have managed to weave into their grand narrative of Russia as the epitome of a Christian country. Even Stalin was doing the work of the Lord in preserving
Wow.
Russia against fascism. And yes, nobody in Russia disputes that Stalin killed, between 10 and 30 million of his own people. Nobody disputes that. But the vast majority of people, I think the last poll, it was like 2/3 of Russians think that Stalin was on the whole a good ruler for Russia, um, mostly because they beat the Nazis because of him. So the logic is like, well, if Stalin hadn't collectivized the peasants in 1929 and 30, which cost 10 million lives, we wouldn't have been able to industrialize, which means we wouldn't have had tanks and planes and armaments when the Nazis invaded. Therefore, it was a necessary evil kind of thing. So
Wow.
it's very Christian now. Putin is, by all accounts, very devout. He sees himself as a devout Christian, and so yeah, it's very Christian. Now, I said I wanted to take it in two parts. The nation thing is where it starts to get hard to compare it, especially to like the Christian nationalism conversations that are happening now, which I find very interesting. Russia was never a nation, and it isn't a nation now. It's always been an empire and seen itself as an empire. It's always been multinational, multi-ethnic, and maybe most relevantly here, multi-confessional, meaning the Russian czars always saw themselves as patrons and kind of paternalistic fathers to all of their subjects, whether they're Muslims or Lutherans or Orthodox. Um, so it's hard for me to kind of compare apples to apples with the conversations that happen. That, I mean, that is one of the sticking points too, as far as I understand it, with the Christian nationalism conversations, is what do you do with ethnic diversity? What do you do with religious diversity? How important or unimportant is ethnicity and common heritage and all of that kind of thing? In Russia, that's never been a precondition for unity, in ways that are very different than, like, if you think of German nationalism or something, which by definition was ethnocentric, that was baked into it. Russian patriotism, let's call it, was never precluded the inclusion of people who thought and believed differently. So that's why I'd say, I mean, it's definitely a Christian country, but it's not quite a Christian nation in the way that I think some people are talking about Christian nations. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
that makes sense. Yeah, it's like, it's weird for me because I've been listening to a lot of different resources on Americans' history, and growing up in high school in 2001 to 2005. I mean, that was a fallout of 9/11, all that kind of stuff. And I had always been taught, we're a nation, all this kind of stuff. But then when you look at the history of how we've behaved in the world, we behave like an empire. We have a bunch of vassal
Hmm.
states that we give money to and expect favors in return, and we kind of view ourselves as the spreader of democracy and all this kind of stuff. And obviously, we have our own narrative. We're trying to prevent communism in Korea and Vietnam and other places, but we do behave. America does behave like an empire, and you'll get that kind of the term global American empire, GAE, which so happens to say gay. And so, like, there's this kind of like weird dissonance that we as Americans have, where we think of ourselves as a nation, but we behave like an empire. And so I guess with Russian history and it being self-consciously Christian, it introduces it. You could say it problematizes the situation a little bit, because I really don't know what to make of it. And then you see
Mm-hmm.
I'll see random propaganda put out. I'm assuming it's propaganda. At least it's, at the very least, it's commercials that the Russians will put out saying, I saw one commercial where it's like they're on an airline flight and it's Russia to America, and it's like, this guy's trying to use the restroom, and it's an American airline that he's on, and it's like, no, you got to let the gay person go first. No, you got to let the black person go first. No, you got to. And so like they're putting out propaganda that's very like anti-Western, and the way they perceive Western is like very leftist, liberal, sexually permissive environment. And so how should we perceive of that? Because like when I first see that, I kind of chuckle, but I also know this is like Russian propaganda. Is
Yeah.
that like what's going on there? Is it truly they're self-consciously like, not a fan of liberal democracy, or what why are they putting that stuff out?
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting to think of it that way. And I have thought of like in this discussion that I have observed, especially, conservative Christian Americans who, and I assumed that it was just kind of a liberal, straw man that, oh, all of these conservative Americans love Putin and they want Trump to be Putin, right? This dates back to the era when it was like somehow sensical to refer to Trump as a dictator and stuff like that, right? Just
Right.
this,
Yeah.
that was a part of that kind of, oh, like Trump and Putin are two peas in a pod. They're exactly the same. And then there were conservative Christians who were like, well, wait a minute, Putin is fighting back against like the, transgenderism, and Putin is fighting back against left-wing nuttery and all of this stuff. And so there was this kind of, um, this affinity. I don't know how accurate that is, or like I said, or how much of that was just trying to besmirch kind of conservative objections to the idea that Trump was Hitler. But I think insofar as there is an affinity from conservatives the world around to what Putin is doing, by virtue of the fact that some of these like culture war things, he seems to be on the same side as conservative Christians elsewhere. I think it's illusory. I mean, it's there's so much daylight between the way Putin sees the world and any American sees the world, like let alone a conservative American who thinks that the Constitution is good and who thinks that there's something to salvage from Western civilization. And Putin sees Russia as being the alternative to Western civilization. And they talk now about Russian civilization as in, there's like Russian civilization, there's Western civilization, there's Eastern civilization. And these things are different things. They're incompatible. And he's not a fan of liberal democracy. He's not a fan of republicanism. He has such a radically different set of priors that the coincidence of some, flashy culture war issues is, uh, in my opinion, totally irrelevant. I mean, Al Qaeda is also against gay marriage. It's like,
Right.
you know what I'm saying? I don't, I just,
Yeah.
it's a very, very superficial kind of affinity. So what should you think about the propaganda? Um, I think it's pretty funny that Russia sees that in us and is able to call it out. I think that's hilarious. That's one thing they're really good at, and they've been really good at for a long time. In the 1940s and 50s, well, even before that, in the 1920s, through probably until the Civil Rights Movement, the Soviet Union was constantly hosing this propaganda about segregation and calling out our hypocrisy and calling out our racism, our institutionalized racism, and saying like, you guys are, and they would bring all of these real famous Harlem Renaissance poets and musicians and artists over to the Soviet Union and kind of roll out the red carpet for them, no pun intended, I guess, and kind of treat them very well, and everybody loved them, and it was a conspicuous alternative to images of black only water fountains in Birmingham or whatever. So they've
Yeah.
always had our number, and they're very
Okay.
good at exploiting that. It doesn't mean that Russia has anything really to offer in terms of political alternatives now, any more than it did in 1930 when Stalin was promoting, racial equality. He was right about that. right? It's like, that was better
Yeah.
than not letting Black people go to your water fountains, of course. But does that say anything? Does that move the ball down the field towards wanting a Stalinist dictatorship? Not in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I don't think in many people's opinion it would. But
Yeah.
that's a really good point. Thanks for helping me think through that. Kind of last question I wanted to end on is on a little bit of literature. If people wanted to read more and understand more of the Russian Christian mindset, I had to read Dostoevsky in high school. We read Crime and Punishment. And back in high school, I'll admit I was studious in that I knew how to get good grades, but I read the Iliad, the Odyssey, all that stuff, but I don't remember any of it. I was not very like in tune with what was happening.
None of
And
us
so if
were.
somebody wanted to read something, some people seem to have been like very into the classics. And I'm like, I probably made fun of those people in high school. But if if somebody wanted to read Dostoevsky, and it's like his most Christian work, is there a work you would recommend by him that maybe would give some insight into the Russian kind of Christian mindset?
Dostoevsky is, I love Dostoevsky, and I teach classes on some of his novels and in some of my history classes and stuff like that. So I love reading Dostoevsky. He's kind of an interesting character when it comes to his Christianity, because he somewhat notoriously didn't ever really give an account of his own like conversion experience, which you would have thought, this very psychologically in tuned writer would have been eager to discuss, but he doesn't. His book In the House of the Dead, or Notes from the House of the Dead, which is his book about the time he spent in exile, in Siberian exile camps, it's kind of quasi autobiographical, and that was the period in his life when he converted and went from being uh, uh, dabbling with socialism and radicalism to being, vehemently opposed to radicalism. But that book doesn't really lay that out very clearly. As far as his most Christian book, I mean, I think Crime and Punishment, Brothers Karamazov have deep, deep Christian themes that I think reward reading from Christians who want to think about important themes of redemption and sin and uh, the importance of the word. One of the themes that doesn't get talked about a lot in Crime and Punishment, that to me is a really compelling kind of Christian through line, is that Raskolnikov, the main character, who commits the murder, and it's not a spoiler, it happens at the beginning of the book. He like in his like wrestling and in his talking about it, and then later when the police are investigating him, and a lot of the discussions about that act, it gets framed as the deed, the act. He even early on he just talks about the act, and you don't even know yet what he's talking about, and that gets distinguished throughout the novel with words. And so there's like this logocentrism that I find really compelling in it. So Sonia, when he finally moves tortuously towards redemption and towards repentance and confession, he has this friend Sonia who brings him essentially to the Lord. And one of the key scenes in the novel is the reading of the Lazarus story, the reading of Jesus's resurrection of Lazarus, which of course is one of the kind of quintessential moments where the Gospels demonstrate the power of Christ's word. Right, Christ is the Word, but Christ's words are as powerful as God the Father's words. He creates life with His word, and Sonia so she reads this story to Raskolnikov. It's clearly saying you need to be regenerated, you need to be resurrected, and the only way to do it is through words, through Christ's word to you, which I am now speaking by virtue of reading the Gospels to you. And then also she harps on him to say it out loud, to confess. So he kind of mealy mouth confesses to her in private a few times, like well before the end of the novel, where he's kind of like, I did it, I did the deed, and I shouldn't have. It's this kind of, he's clearly remorseful, but he's speaking of it euphemistically, and he's also not speaking of it in public. And so what she tells him is, you have to say it out loud. You have to say it out loud. And then in the climax of the novel, he goes to the crossroads, which in Russian is перекресток, which is the same, it has the word cross in it, just like in English. And he goes to the cross and he says it out loud in public. And that's his, that's the kind of spiritual climax of the novel. So it's unmistakable that this is it's an awesome scene too, because it's like in a public market and no one notices. Everybody thinks he's just crazy. It's not like there are no angels that descend. Nobody hugs him or anything like that. It's just this totally anticlimactic. So you're going to get a lot of Russian culture and a lot of Russian-ness through that. But you're also going to get gospel, and you're going to get big, hard questions. We read it at my school. I teach a liberal arts course, a great books course for freshmen. So we have 600 freshmen who take this class every year, and we've read Crime and Punishment, and it's fun to talk about with students who have, not the same framework as I'm coming from, but yeah, that's awesome. A great book.
Yeah.
There's more to say about Russian literature, but I don't want to bore your listeners.
Yeah. You're not going to bore the listeners, and if you do, I don't really care. I'm interested in it, but we could keep talking about it for a while, I'm sure. David, if people wanted to stay in touch, see what you're up to, or hear more of your work, is there a place they can find you? Obviously, they can go enroll at University of Houston if they wanted, but is there anywhere else people can keep up with what you're working on?
I have a website, just davidrainbow.com, where it's mostly kind of where I've had my professional stuff on, like classes I teach and some things that I've written. And then I actually have a Twitter handle. I'm not super active, but that's been kind of recent for me, like learning more about getting into, some of the debates and stuff. It's fun. I like following you. It's fun sort of like seeing what people are talking about. And it's been very eye-opening because I've been a decidedly kind of, non-Twitter user for many years. But that's David-Rainbow is my handle, I think. So yeah, I'd love to hear from any of your listeners. I love your podcast. It's been really fun to listen to, and I'm honored that you wanted to talk to me.
Yeah, for sure, man. And maybe we'll have to have you back on as things continue to progress over there in Ukraine. It's a really fascinating topic, and I'm really thankful for men like you, Christians like you in the Academy, who have devoted a lot of time to researching this stuff that I, in my own capacities, I don't have time to do, but appreciate you coming on, sharing with our listeners some more context, more information, and it's been really helpful. So thanks for coming on the show today, David.
Yeah, it's been great. Thanks, Chase.
Hey, if you're a listener and you enjoyed this episode, I'd love it if you share it with somebody, start a conversation with somebody in real life, not just online, about Russian history. Maybe talk about the war in Ukraine. Maybe you got a friend flying a Ukraine flag out front, and you could send this to them, be like, hey, we should get a beer and talk about this. I think that'd be a great way to help people today, like we talked about in earlier in the episode, avoid kind of political radicalism. So do that. Leave a rating on YouTube, iTunes, wherever you are. 5 stars. Give it a great rating. Subscribe. You can also sign up on the Patreon, and you can get free swag when you sign up. And we can also start conversations on there as well. You can ask any questions. Give me some audience feedback there, and we have great discussions on the Patreon. So sign up there, and we'll see you next time.